There is a moment an empath reaches that almost nobody notices at first, not even the empath themselves. The voice is still soft. The eyes still look calm. They still answer messages, still show up, still smile at the right moments. But internally, something has already gone quiet. And the terrifying part is, it does not happen loudly. No breakdown, no dramatic goodbye, no visible collapse, just silence. A silence so heavy it almost feels physical, like emotional absence pressing slowly against your chest until you cannot tell whether you are exhausted or simply no longer emotionally available to the world around you. Most people never realize this. They think empaths break through tears, through emotional reactions, through visible pain, but the real shift begins when the nervous system stops reacting altogether. When emotional overload becomes so constant that the body quietly chooses survival over feeling. Have you noticed this about yourself? You used to absorb every emotion, ion in the room before anyone spoke. You could sense tension through silence alone. You felt responsible for emotional balance everywhere you went. Other people's moods entered your body before logic had time to protect you. And for a long time, you believed this sensitivity was connection. But here is what changes everything. The nervous system does not distinguish between emotional empathy and emotional danger forever. Eventually, after enough emotional inconsistency, enough emotional labor, enough invisible hypervigilance, the body begins recalibrating itself. This is where the shift begins. Not emotionally, biologically, because an empath is rarely exhausted from one painful event. They are exhausted from continuous subconscious monitoring, constant emotional pattern tracking, continuous internal regulation, watching facial expressions, monitoring tone changes, predicting emotional reactions before they happen, preparing for emotional instability before it arrives. Most people never realize how exhausting this becomes, especially when the empath grew up learning that emotional safety depended on reading everyone correctly. That is where this pattern usually begins. Childhood environments where unpredictability trained the nervous system to stay alert. Homes where silence meant tension, where emotional withdrawal felt dangerous, where love became tied to emotional performance, emotional caretaking, emotional adaptation. So the empath learned something powerful very early. If I can feel everyone deeply enough, maybe I can stay safe. And at first, this adaptation looks beautiful from the outside. They become emotionally intelligent, attentive, deeply understanding, emotionally available. People feel seen around them, heard around them, understood around them. But internally, the empath slowly disappears beneath everyone else's emotional reality. Because while everyone praises their sensitivity, almost nobody asks what constant emotional absorption costs them. There is a moment people completely miss. The empath stops asking themselves how they feel because they are too busy monitoring everyone else. And once that happens for long enough, emotional exhaustion no longer feels like exhaustion. It feels normal. This is why many empaths do not realize they are burned out until their nervous system suddenly goes silent. Not calm, silent. There is a difference. Real calm feels safe, open, regulated, present. Nervous system silence feels empty, like your emotional world has been placed underwater, like reactions are delayed, like the body no longer wants to participate emotionally because emotional participation became associated with depletion. And this is the moment relationships begin changing permanently because people who benefited from the empath's emotional availability immediately feel the difference. Even if nothing is said, the empath stops over explaining, stops chasing emotional repair, stops volunteering emo, channel energy into one sided dynamics, stops trying to rescue disconnected people from themselves. And suddenly others feel uncomfortable, not because the empath became cruel, but because access changed. Most people never realize how dependent they became on the empath's emotional labor until it disappears. This is why some relationships become strangely tense when an empath begins emotionally recalibrating. The empath becomes quieter, slower, more observant, less emotionally reactive. And people interpret this silence incorrectly. They think the empath no longer cares. But the truth is far more complicated. The empath cares deeply. Their nervous system simply cannot survive emotional overextension anymore. So the body begins protecting itself automatically. Subconscious adaptation. This is why emotionally exhausted empaths often feel detached in situations that once overwhelmed them. Arguments that once triggered panic now create numbness. Emotional inconsistency that on C E caused obsession now creates distance, not because healing is complete, but because the nervous system reached capacity. Imagine carrying emotional static inside your body for years. Every room too loud emotionally. Every relationship requiring unconscious monitoring. Every conversation processed at 10 different emotional levels simultaneously. Eventually, the system shuts doors internally, not to punish others, to survive. Have you noticed how some empaths suddenly lose interest in explaining themselves? That shift matters more than people think, because chronic emotional explaining usually comes from fear of disconnection, fear of misunderstanding, fear of emotional abandonment. But once emotional exhaustion becomes severe enough, the empath realizes something painful. No amount of explaining can force emotional safety. And that realization changes everything. This is where cognitive detachment begins. The empath starts observing instead of absorbing. They begin notic, eyeing patterns without emotionally attaching to every pattern they see. They stop translating people's behavior into personal responsibility. They stop assuming emotional distance is theirs to repair. At first, this feels unnatural, even guilty, because empaths are often conditioned to believe emotional self sacrifice equals love. So when they begin emotionally withdrawing from unhealthy dynamics, the nervous system initially experiences conflict. Part of them wants rest, another part still feels responsible for everyone. This creates a strange internal split. The body wants silence, the conditioning wants connection, and this tension becomes psychologically exhausting. Most people never realize how many empaths are functioning inside chronic nervous system dysregulation while appearing emotionally composed externally. That composure is often survival, because highly sensitive people learn early how to hide overwhelm. They become experts at appearing calm while internally stimulated, smiling while emotionally flooded, listening while mentally depleted. But eventually, the performance becomes impossible to maintain, not because the empath becomes weak, because the nervous system stops cooperating. This is why emotional numbness often arrives after prolonged hyperempathy. The body cannot remain emotionally open without limits forever. And once emotional depletion crosses a certain threshold, something haunting happens internally. The empath stops reaching emotionally, not intentionally, automatically. The nervous system begins conserving energy by reducing emotional output. Text becomes shorter. Social interaction feels heavier. Emotional engagement starts feeling physically expensive. Even love begins feeling exhausting when the body associates connection with emotional depletion. There is a moment people completely miss. The empath is not becoming cold. They are becoming overstimulated beyond recovery. This is why silence becomes addictive afterward, because silence finally feels safer than emotional unpredictability. No emotional monitoring, no subconscious scanning, no emotional pressure to regulate others, just stillness. And for the first time in years, the nervous system can finally unclench. But here is what becomes dangerous. Some empaths stay in this detached state so long that emotional shutdown starts becoming identity instead of recovery. They stop trusting connection entirely. They stop believing emotional reciprocity exists. They convince themselves isolation is peace because peace is the only thing that no longer hurts their nervous system. Most people never realize this transformation happens gradually, not through one heartbreak, but through accumulated emotional depletion, tiny betrayals, continuous emotional imbalance, repeated emotional inconsistency, feeling emotionally unseen while constantly seeing everyone else. Eventually, the subconscious reaches a conclusion. Feeling deeply is no L, on go or safe. And once this belief settles into the nervous system, relationships begin changing at a profound level. Because emotionally exhausted empaths stop searching for intensity. They start searching for regulation. This is why certain connections suddenly become unbearable. Loud personalities, emotionally chaotic people, inconsistent communication, manipulative emotional cycles. The empath's nervous system no longer experiences these dynamics as attraction. It experiences them as threat. And this realization shocks many people, especially those who built relationships around the empath's endless emotional availability. Because once the empath internally disconnects, access disappears quietly. No argument, no dramatic closure, just emotional distance. And emotional distance from an empath feels different than ordinary withdrawal. It feels final. Because empaths usually tolerate emotional imbalance far beyond healthy limits. So when they finally stop reaching, it means something inside them has fundamentally changed. Once this happens internally, the connection changes permanently, even if the empath returns physically, even if they speak kindly, even if they try again. Something inside the nervous system remembers the exhaustion. This is why emotionally burned out empaths often feel emotionally cautious afterward. Their body remembers overstimulation even when their mind wants connection. Have you noticed this about yourself? You no longer chase people the way you once did. You no longer panic over emotional distance immediately. You notice inconsistency faster. You become tired more quickly around emotionally demanding people. That is not accidental. Your nervous system is tracking emotional costs now. And once the body begins measuring emotional safety instead of emotional intensity, attraction patterns start changing too. This is where identity restructuring begins. The empath slowly realizes they were never responsible for carrying everyone emotionally. But this realization feels disorienting at first because emotional caretaking became intertwined with identity. Who are you if you stop emotionally rescuing everyone? Who are you if you stop absorbing pain to maintain connection? Who are you if you finally prioritize internal regulation over emotional attachment? Most people never ask themselves these questions because many empaths unconsciously build their self worth around emotional usefulness, around being needed, around being emotionally indispensable. So when the nervous system finally shuts down, the empath initially mistakes the silence for emptiness. But here is what changes everything. Sometimes silence is not emptiness, sometimes silence is recovery. Sometimes the nervous system goes quiet because it is trying to rebuild an identity beneath years of emotional overstimulation. And this process feels deeply lonely because the empath starts recognizing how many relationships were built around emotional access rather than mutual emotional safety. That realization hurts differently, not dramatically, quietly, like sitting beside someone you once felt deeply connected to and suddenly realizing your nervous system no longer relaxes around them. Imagine a silence so heavy it feels physical. That is what emotional disconnection feels like for an empath after prolonged exhaustion. Not hatred, not resentment, just absence. The body no longer reaches where it once begged for connection. And the frightening part is how calm it looks externally. People think the empath is healing because they stopped reacting. But sometimes the empath stopped reacting because the nervous system no longer believes reacting changes anything. There is a moment people completely miss. The opposite of emotional intensity is not peace. Sometimes it is shutdown. This is why emotionally exhausted empaths often confuse numbness with healing at first. After years of overwhelm, numbness feels relatable, not even. The absence of emotional chaos feels unfamiliar enough to resemble peace, but true healing does not erase feeling. It restores safety inside feeling, and that distinction matters. Because some empaths become trapped in emotional detachment for years without realizing it. They function normally, work normally, speak normally, but internally, emotional participation remains limited, protected, restricted. The nervous system keeps emotional walls active because vulnerability still feels associated with depletion. This is where subconscious adaptation becomes visible in relationships. The empath starts leaving conversations emotionally earlier than physically. They listen less deeply, invest less quickly, reveal less emotionally. They become harder to access, not because they lost depth, because they finally realize depth without reciprocity destroys them. Most people never realize how painful this realization becomes for someone who once loved through complete emotion. Allopenness, especially because empaths often mourn internally long before relationships end externally. By the time they physically detach, the nervous system has usually been grieving for months, sometimes years, quietly, tracking emotional imbalance, tracking inconsistency, tracking exhaustion, until one day the emotional bond no longer feels alive inside them. And once emotional absence settles into the nervous system, reconnecting becomes difficult because the empath remembers. The body remembers who required self abandonment. The body remembers who drained regulation. The body remembers who only valued access to empathy without protecting the empath emotionally in return. This is why some empaths disappear emotionally without warning, not out of cruelty, out of nervous system survival. And ironically, this is often the first time they truly begin listening to themselves. Have you noticed how many sensitive people spend years ignoring their own emotional exhaustion? Because they believe caring means enduring. That belief changes people slowly. It teaches them to override discomfort, override intuition, override internal warning signs until eventually the nervous system intervenes itself. Silence, emotional shutdown, detachment, exhaustion, withdrawal, not weakness, a biological response to chronic emotional overload. But here is what becomes haunting afterward. Once the empath experiences life without constant emotional overextension, they can never fully return to unconscious self sacrifice again, even if they try. Something internally is already awakened. The realization that love without emotional safety eventually becomes nervous system damage. And once someone understands this deeply, their standards change permanently. Not superficial standards, energetic standards. They stop romanticizing emotional chaos. Stop interpreting inconsistency as depth. Stop confusing emotional pain with emotional connection. This is where the email path becomes difficult to manipulate emotionally because manipulation depends on emotional access. And emotionally exhausted empaths eventually learn the difference between compassion and self erasure. That distinction changes their entire relational world. Suddenly, they notice who only contacts them during emotional crises. Who expects emotional labor without reciprocity? Who feels entitled to emotional availability while remaining emotionally unavailable themselves? Patterns become impossible to ignore afterward. Most people never realize sensitivity becomes dangerous when boundaries are absent, because an unprotected empath eventually absorbs so much emotional instability that their own nervous system loses clarity between self and others. That is why emotional recalibration feels almost spiritual afterward. The empath starts separating their emotions from everyone else's emotions for the first time. And this process feels strange, quiet, unfamiliar, like standing alone, not emotionally after spending years carrying invisible emotional weight for everyone around you. At first, loneliness intensifies because the empath realizes how many relationships depended on overfunctioning emotionally. But then something unexpected happens. The nervous system begins softening differently, not toward chaos, toward safety, toward consistency, toward calm voices, toward emotionally regulated people, toward environments where the body no longer feels hyperalert. This is where genuine healing quietly begins, not through intensity, through nervous system safety. And many empaths struggle to trust this at first because calm once felt unfamiliar. Chaos felt emotionally stimulating. Emotional unpredictability felt magnetic. But eventually, the body becomes too tired to romanticize survival patterns anymore. This is where the deepest transformation happens. The empath realizes they were never too sensitive. They were chronically exposed to emotional environment. TS their nervous system was never meant to carry alone. That realization changes self perception permanently. Suddenly, their exhaustion makes sense. Their withdrawal makes sense. Their emotional numbness makes sense. The silence was never random. The nervous system was trying to protect what remained of them internally. And once the empath understands this, guilt slowly begins dissolving. They stop apologizing for emotional boundaries, stop apologizing for needing solitude, stop apologizing for no longer overextending themselves to maintain connection. Because now they understand something most people never realize. A nervous system that never feels safe eventually stops opening completely. And the tragedy is, many empaths spend years blaming themselves for this closure without recognizing what caused it. Continuous emotional depletion, continuous emotional monitoring, continuous subconscious survival, until one day the body quietly whispers, no more, not angrily, not dramatically, just finally. And that is the dangerous moment an empath's nervous system goes silent, because externally almost nothing changes at first. But internally, an entire emotional world begins restructuring itself. The empath starts choosing peace over emotional access, distance over depletion, regulation over attachment trauma. And people who only understood the empath through emotional availability suddenly feel confused by the silence. But the empath is no longer trying to be understood by everyone anymore. That phase is ending because once someone spends years carrying emotional intensity that was never there to hold, eventually the soul becomes exhausted from translating pain into love. And when that exhaustion reaches its limit, something irreversible happens. The empath finally stops abandoning themselves to keep other people comfortable, quietly, completely, permanently.